Welcome to our study of the Parasha according to the very creative and insightful teachings of Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz. This is a name that is familiar to us in Jewish history. I don't need to review the history of it now, but if you wonder what all the excitement is about regarding him and his prominence and his, legacy. We'll give you an insight into that right now. Okay, so we are looking at Parshas Vayetzei. The Parsha begins chapter 28, verse 10. Vayetzei Yaakov Beersheva vayelech Harana. Yaakov is on the run. He is fleeing his brother Esav, who has expressed his intention to kill him when he has the opportunity to do so. Actually, we spoke about that last week a little bit as well. And then the Torah says that immediately the next pasuk, Vayifga b'makom, he encountered the place Vayalen Sham, and he lay down there for the night, Kiva HaShemesh, because the sun had set. And he took some of the stones and put them around his head. Vayishkav b'makom hahu, and he lay down in that place. The significance of the stones, Rashi interprets it homiletically, but at the simple level, he used the stones for protection. He was exposed to the elements. He did not have a chance to get to the Jerusalem Holiday Inn, or even something a bit more down market, because the sun set precipitously, and the Torah indicates that he was compelled to spend the night there, and so he did. So he used those stones as a kind of protection. It's always bothered me, to be honest, how wild animals could be prevented from attacking him just because he put some stones around his head, or even if he makes a little, field for himself with a stone wall. I saw a video a few months ago during the worldwide lockdown, I think from South America, of a jaguar that jumped about 15 feet high to jump over a fence. I mean, wild animals are not going to be put off by a stone wall. Okay, so with that idea in mind, I'd like to share with you what Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says about this. V'hinei Hashem turned to one further pasuk, Vayachalom, he had a dream, and then pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13. V'hinei Hashem nitzav alav. God was standing above him in his dream. Of course, at the top of the ladder, as is very well known, the very famous biblical imagery of the ladder. So Rashi says Hashem was standing there leshamro, to protect him. And the word nitzav is like an honor guard, someone who is standing erect and alert to protect the one whose well-being is his responsibility. That's the word nitzav. God is protecting him. Okay, very nice. And Hashem gives him an assurance that Malach and these angels, firstly, we know angels are can be protective, but angels can also be emissaries of harm, whether the angel of death or angels that are executing judgment against a person. So angels, to borrow a phrase, carry a two-edged sword, cherev pipios biyadam. Especially these angels represent the umos ha'olam, the nations of the world. So Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says the angels sought to harm Yaakov. Why did they want to harm him? Because where was he sleeping? The Torah doesn't say so explicitly, but he himself, when he wakes up, he says, I did not realize this was a holy place. If I had known, I would not have slept here. because he was sleeping on Har Habayis. He was sleeping on what we call today the Temple Mount, and this is the mountain literally which is held up by the Kotel. The other side of the Kotel is where the Beis Hamikdash stood. According to our tradition, Yaakov was sleeping in the very place where his father Yitzchak was nearly sacrificed. In other words, this is a holy place, and it is destined to be designated as the place where the temple will be built in Yerushalayim. Says Rav Yonatan Eibeschutz, the Malachim were very perturbed that Yaakov was sleeping there, because you're not allowed to sleep in the Beis Hamikdash. You know that one is not even allowed to sit down. The Kotel is the other side. It's really the outer wall. But in the precinct of the Beis Hamikdash itself, no one is allowed to sit except for the descendants of David HaMelech himself. Otherwise, they're not allowed to sit. Even the Kohanim are not allowed to sit. They do their avoda, they do the service, but they only are allowed to stand. They're not allowed to sit. He is sleeping, lays down to sleep in a place where one is not even allowed to sit. Why did he? So that's why the Malachim were, so to speak, ready to execute judgment against him. So why did he do it? So the Torah implies that he put those stones around his head to protect him from the animals. His concern was like this: he is now sleeping in a field, in a forest, in a place which is completely open and unprotected, and he's fearful for his life. So he considered the matter of utmost importance to preserve his well-being, to preserve his life, that he should be allowed to sleep in the Makom HaMikdash, because the wild animals won't enter there. That is to say, when the divine presence is manifest, so these wild animals, these ferocious animals, will not enter there. And in that case, that's the one place where he's able to sleep, let's say, peacefully, or at least safely. So he considered a pikuach nefesh, and therefore he lay down to sleep in that location. But the Malachim felt that, and by the way, that's why the prophet Jeremiah in Eicha, he bemoans the fact that the holy mountain Shualim Holchu Va. He says that the place of foxes, foxes are it's become the domain of jackals, and foxes are roaming around there. And this is sort of the metaphor for the degradation of the temple after its destruction. And of course, although the Rabbi Eibeschutz doesn't mention it, he's probably alluding as well to the famous story of Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues who looked to the Har Habayis and they saw jackals roaming around there. So that's foxes. Okay, foxes. Yeah. So Ruthie is a fox. So we have some sympathy for foxes in this family, for those who know Ruthie's maiden name. But that's after the Churban. But under more favorable circumstances, wild animals will not venture there. So that's why he felt he's allowed to sleep. Why were the angels, so to speak, angry at him? Because the angels were of the view that a tzaddik does not have to be afraid of wild animals. The presence of Hashem, the aura of Hashem that surrounds a tzaddik, protects him from the wild animals. He should not resort to that kind of device, that kind of strategy to sleep in the Makom HaMikdash for his own safety. His righteousness will protect him from the wild animals. Now, although he doesn't mention this, I would like to add that the Netziv, one of the great, more recent Torah personalities, lived actually in the 19th century, but about 100 years after Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz. The Netziv writes regarding Yosef. We'll read in a few weeks' time, soon actually, we'll read about Yosef, who is dispatched on a dangerous mission. His father probably did not appreciate how dangerous the mission was. And as we know, his brothers nearly killed him. Instead, they sold him into slavery, but they took his garment, his coat of many colors, they slashed it with a sword in a few places, they dipped it in blood, and they sent it by a courier, American Federal Express, to their father, and they say, "Do you recognize this?" And Yaakov was distraught. He said, "This is the garment of my son. Taraf Yosef. Yosef has been torn apart." According to the Netziv, the reason Yaakov was so astonished is that he knew that Yosef was righteous, and he knew that his righteousness should therefore protect him from wild animals. Yaakov did not think that his own flesh and blood, that his own children would kill their brother. He didn't think that was possible, but he thought that he would be protected from wild animals because of his innate righteousness. That's why he was so astonished. Tarof Taraf Yosef. How could it be that a ferocious animal has torn apart Yosef? That's how the Netziv explains it, because a person who is perfectly righteous has no reason to fear from wild animals. In any case, that's how Rav Yonatan Eibeschutz explains why he slept there, why were the Malachim angry with him, and why Hashem protected him, so to speak, from the ire of the Malachim. Probably, again, if we follow this logic, we would say that Yaakov, in his own humility, did not consider himself so righteous as to be automatically protected from the predations of a mountain lion or a jackal or something like that. And therefore, he felt it was necessary for him to sleep in Har Habayis, since the sun set precipitously. He didn't have time to get to a place of lodging. Okay, let's continue a little bit further. After he wakes up from his dream and he makes a declaration, and he says, having gotten the assurance, the divine assurance that he's going to survive, he's going to flourish. In fact, he will ultimately return to his homeland in peace, in one piece as well. So he wakes up in the morning. Vayashkem Yaakov baboker. I'm reading Pasuk Yud Ches, verse 18. Vayashkem Yaakov baboker, and Yaakov awoke in the morning, and he articulated a neder, a vow in Pasuk Chaf in verse 20. Vayidar Yaakov neder lemor. If God is with me and He protects me along this way that I travel, v'nasani lechem lechol uveged lilbosh. He gives me bread to eat and a garment to wear. Then, I'm just turning my pages here because there's a lot of commentaries in this volume that I'm using. And I return in peace. Then he says, this rock, verse 22, this rock that I have designated as a monument will be a house of God. In other words, the Beis Hamikdash will be built in this very place, as indeed it would be hundreds of years later. And here's the point I want to get to. And everything you give me, I will give a tithe. Aser asrenu lach. And this is the first place in the Torah where we have, actually not the first place, we had an earlier place, but this is in the Torah where we find the expression aser asrenu, where we find the idea of giving a tenth. We had it earlier in Parashas Lech Lecha when Abraham gave to Melchizedek Veitin Aser Mikol. But here's the first time of the expression Aser Asrenu. I will surely tithe. Says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, it's a very nice, beautiful little thought. It's quite well known. The Talmud says that the Torah says later on, Aser ta'aser, you shall give a tithe, you shall surely tithe. Aser ta'aser. Says the Talmud, a famous passage, Aser, give a tenth, Kadeshetit asher, so that you will become wealthy. It's a play on words. Aser means a tenth. Ein, sin, resh, like the word eser, 10. Aser means give a tenth or tithe. The English word tithe, of course, derives from the same source. But the word, the same spelling, ein, shin, resh, spells like ashirut, which is wealth. So the Talmud interprets it homiletically. If you give a tenth, you will become wealthy. And the Talmud even goes further as to say, put God to the test. Try him out. Aser, give a tenth so that you will become wealthy and see if it works. V'chanuni na bazos. This is the one instance, the one area, we mentioned this, I think last week as well, in a different context, in which one is allowed to test Hashem. We said that Esav was fond of this mitzvah. Says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, he says, Yaakov says, Aser asenu lach, I will give a tenth for your sake, not for my sake. I won't do it with that calculus that by giving a tenth, I'm going to profit. I'm going to become wealthy as a result. I didn't do it with a vested interest. Aser asenu lach, I will give a tenth for you. That is to say, to fulfill the will of God, or we might say for the benefit of other people, for out of reasons of humanitarianism, compassion, benevolence, to give to others, not because I've calculated that with this divine promise, the more I give, the richer I get. That's not my intention. It's not my motivation. Aser asenu lach. That's how he interprets the emphasis on the lach, that I will give a tenth to you. Now, shortly after, in his travels, he makes his way to Haran, and it's quite interesting. Take a look at Pasuk Dalet, verse 4, 29, verse 4. So Yaakov makes his way to Haran, which is where he was instructed to go to his mother's family in order to seek a wife. And he sees some shepherds gathered at a well, and there's a big rock over the well. And it seems that this boulder is there to prevent just passers-by from accessing the waters. According to some, actually, this was not a well spring, but this was really a cistern. So the water is a limited commodity. It doesn't bubble up from the ground continuously. The rainwater is collected there. When it's gone until the next rainfall. So that's why they had a system where they covered it with a boulder, and those shepherds who were allowed to access the water would gather and remove the rock, this big boulder. Excuse me. So Yaakov sees them and he says, Achai, my brethren, may I atem, where are you from? And they say, we're from Haran. So he says, hey, Haran, that's exactly where I'm going. And I wonder whether you know my uncle. Lavan ben Nachor. Yeah, we know him. Now, the interesting thing is, Lavan, who was his father? His father was not Nachor. Nachor was his grandfather. Or maybe great-grandfather, but his father was Betuel. Now we know this because in Parshas Chayei, the servant of Avraham made his way to the same family. There he met Lavan and he met Betuel. Betuel is the father of Lavan. But he doesn't say Lavan ben Betuel. And Rabbi Yonatan has an explanation as to why he didn't mention Betuel, but the point is Betuel had died. And that's why he says Ben Nachor, from the family of Nachor, but his father Betuel is no longer in the picture. Okay, but what's fascinating is, we'll see the significance of that in a moment. What's fascinating is that they say, yeah, we know him, and they say, yeah, is he well? Yes, he's well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming with its own. V'hinei Rachel bito ba imatzon. It's a bit of onomatopoeic there, where the sound, the bleating of the sheep is reflected there. Ba imatzon. Okay, that's just by the by. But what's fascinating, take a look, please, at Pasuk Yud. Vayhi kasher ra'a Yaakov, verse 10. Vayhi kasher ra'a Yaakov es Rachel bas Lavan achiimo. When Yaakov sees Rachel, the daughter of Lavan, the brother of his mother, ve'est son Lavan, and the flock of Lavan, achi imo, the brother of his mother. V'yigash Yaakov approached, v'yagel ha'even me'al pi ha'be'er, and he rolled off this big boulder from the cistern. V'yash est son Lavan achi imo, and he watered the flock of Lavan, the brother of his mother. I'm sure you can't fail to notice that the Torah says 3 times Lavan achi imo, every time Lavan achi imo. And we already know that Lavan is his mother's brother, and yet the Torah repeats it here 3 times in one verse, emphasizing it as if it's some important information that is relevant to the story and warrants repetition repeatedly. Also, even the reference to the tzon Lavan, to the flock, because the Torah already said, and that's why I pointed it out in Pasuk Vav in verse 6, the shepherds said to Yaakov, V'hinei Rachel bito ba'im hatzon, she's coming with the flock. She's a shepherdess. So why does the Torah mention again here the flock? And now it's true that he's going to water the flock, but why is it necessary to mention twice in the same verse as well? Vestzon Lavan, the flock of Lavan, his mother's his mother's brother. And then again at the end. So Rav Yonatan Eibeschutz has a very clever interpretation here. He says that, excuse me, the Talmud famously teaches that a person who is proposing to marry a woman, I don't mean he's proposing marriage at that moment, but he's contemplating, he's looking over her shidduch CV, and he's considering dating or going out or meeting a certain woman. And naturally, he's interested in the future. He's interested in children from this woman, raising a family with her. That's surely part of his calculus. It may not be the only consideration. Surely it's an important part of his thinking. And he wants to know or anticipate what kind of children, especially what kind of sons, will this woman bear. If I marry her, what can we expect from our children, from our sons in particular? And the Talmud says, Yivdok ba'acheha. He should check out this woman's brother, because most sons are similar to the brother of the mother, to the uncle. Now, actually, some women have more than one brother, which can create a certain, wild card in this calculation, but it be that as it may. So says Yonatan Eibeschutz, if that is the case, and we find in a number of instances that the Torah associates women, that is to say, not women, but boys with the mother and girls with the father. The father is the primary influence or the primary sort of factor in the birth of a girl, and the mother's influence is preeminent in the birth of a boy. We do find such a notion. So he says as follows. Yonatan Eibeschutz says like this, that since if the brothers, if the sons are like the mother's brother, then the daughters are like the father's sister. This is his suggestion, his speculation, according to the Talmudic formula. The daughters are like the father's sister. And that, if that's the case, this Rachel, if she is the daughter of Lavan, who is the brother of Rivka, then she, Rachel, is going to be like his mother, and he would love that. Firstly, he's a mommy's boy. Secondly, Rivka, his mother, is very righteous, very exemplary in so many ways. So he loves the idea. I mean, Esav took local girls, but Yaakov is very motivated with the idea that this girl, who is his cousin, is the daughter of Lavan, who is his mother's brother. And that is why he says, the Torah emphasizes every time, Lavan achi imo, because he's very concerned. That is his main motivation, because Yaakov is keen to marry a woman who is the daughter of his mother's brother. I'm getting myself confused. So that his children will be like his mother. If Rachel is going to be like her aunt, then this is a very attractive consideration for Yaakov. What about the flock? So he says that according to Torah law, according to the law of the Torah, a son inherits from the father. The daughter is presumed to sort of be cared for by her husband. If she doesn't have a husband, then the rabbis have made a certain arrangement for a daughter in terms of inheritance. But according to the Torah law of Bnei Noach, that is to say, in the Torah teaching regarding the general society, so a daughter inherits just like a son. We said already that Betuel is no longer living. That means that Lavan's flock is inherited from his father, which means that Yaakov's mother, Rivka, also has a share in it, because Rivka and Lavan are brother and sister. So Lavan has inherited the flock from his father. Rivka has inherited the flock as well. I mean, she has half of the flock belongs to her. Now, maybe Lavan is looking after it, but she has a share in it, which means that Yaakov has a share in it as well. So that's how he explains it. That's why Yaakov is so interested in the flock as well, because actually that flock, half of it belongs to his mom. And he's especially interested in Rachel as the daughter of Lavan, his mother's brother, using the formula that the daughter of Lavan is probably going to be similar to the sister of Lavan, and that is the righteous Rivka. Okay, I hope I haven't confused you too much with the mishpachology, but now I would like to end our shir tonight with, I think, a beautiful chidush, which I like also because it's an insight into a halachic matter as well, albeit it's in the drash category, as opposed to an actual halachic analysis, but it's fascinating as well. I'm referring to the very first verse in chapter 30. Now, in chapter 29 that we've just looked at the beginning of it, Yaakov meets Rachel. As we know, he's going to marry Rachel, but first he ends up marrying Leah, not so much by his own choice, and he ends up with two wives. Leah he marries first inadvertently, Rachel he marries second, and the two wives are the wives of Yaakov. And Leah has a son, and Leah has another son, and Leah has a third son, and Leah has a fourth son. All the while, Rachel is barren. And the Torah tells us, at the beginning of Perek Lamed, chapter 30, Vateira Rachel kilo yalda Yaakov. Rachel saw that she is not bearing children for Yaakov. V'tikane Rachel ba'achosa, and Rachel becomes jealous of her sister. Vatomer el Yaakov havali vanim. She says to her husband Yaakov, "Give me sons, give me children, give me progeny. V'im ayin meis anoch, and if not, I'm going to die." Very poignant, and certainly anyone with a heart must feel the anguish of Rachel, who is barren. Rachel is beloved. Rachel is Yaakov's chosen wife, and yet all of that is of pales into insignificance when she cannot perform the most expected role of a wife, which is to bear a child. Maybe not it's the most expected, but as I said, it's presumably part of the plan. And to make matters much worse, Leah has one child after another. So he starts off with a chidush, which he says is in the writings of the Rambam. The editor, who has generally done a pretty good job, does not tell me where in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam mentions this. I suppose I could try to research it myself, but let's take his word for it. Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz says that the Rambam teaches us the reason for the prohibition of a man marrying two sisters. And we'll soon consider the fact that Yaakov, of course, has done exactly that. But that's how he approaches it. The interesting thing is that Torah, as is well known, mentions a number of close relationships which are forbidden by way of marital union. So a man is not allowed to marry certain close relatives. It's an incestuous relationship which the Torah forbids. One of those, an example of that which is forbidden, is his uncle's wife. So if a man has an uncle, his father's brother or his mother's brother, and that man is married, so this man is not allowed to marry that woman. Even if the uncle is no longer living, he's still not allowed to marry her because she was married to his uncle, and therefore he's forbidden to her. Or well, both. She's forbidden to her, he's forbidden. She is forbidden to him, and he is forbidden to her because they are related in that regard. The fact that the relationship is no longer current because of the uncle, let's say, is deceased, the prohibition remains. The exception is our relationship that we're considering now of a man who's not allowed to marry two sisters. But that's only true while they are both living. Meaning, if a man marries a woman, even according to the original Torah law, that he's allowed to have a second wife, but he cannot marry her sister. But if the first sister dies, he is allowed to marry the surviving sister. It's only bichayeha, only during the lifetime of the first woman, he's not allowed to marry. So if they get divorced, for example, he's not allowed to marry her sister. But if she passes on to a better world, he is allowed to marry her. And it might be meritorious, even in a certain sense, that woman may be able to carry on the family name, whatever it might be. It's not exactly the mitzvah of Yibum, but the Torah specifically and explicitly permits marrying. A man is allowed to marry his wife's sister if his wife is no longer living. Why? Why is that different? So the Rambam says that the reason the Torah forbids marrying two sisters is that they will be jealous of one another. The jealousy and the strife and the resentment and the sense of rivalry and even hatred that can result from marrying even two women who are not related, but two sisters especially, the risk is too great. That's what the Rambam suggests. He speculates this is the reason why the Torah forbids marrying two sisters, but the Torah allows marrying a woman who is the sister of his first wife when she's deceased, because then the jealousy no longer applies. She's not going to be jealous of someone who's not living any longer. That's how the Rambam explains it. So says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, a very interesting suggestion. He says, of course, we've got a problem why Yaakov married two sisters. This is a famous problem which is discussed by Ramban and many others. How could Yaakov marry two sisters in violation of the Torah prohibition? It's true he was tricked into it, but even so, how could he do it? He's already married Leah, that's it. So Rachel is not allowed. So the suggestion that he advances, and of course this question is only problematic. I'm sorry, I'm a bit into overtime. This question is only problematic according to the rabbinic tradition that although the Torah had not yet been given, nevertheless the holy patriarchs Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, maybe the next generation as well, they kept the Torah even though it had not yet been given. They had a prophetic intuition and they anticipated the Torah and they kept the commandments of the Torah, maybe even rabbinic commandments as well, according to this rabbinic tradition. Again, according to the Torah itself, the Torah had not yet been given, so they were not bound by that. But according to our tradition, that the Avos kept the Torah, this example of a violation requires a resolution. Says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, before
Thank
the
you,
Torah,
it's too bad, too late.
Before the Torah had been given, the fact that these two sisters were not jealous of one another, they were so close, there was such respect, there was such mutual love between them, they were not jealous of one another. And the proof of that is the fact that, according to Rashi at least, Rachel was aware of the fact that her father was a trickster, was a fraudster, and she and Yaakov devised a plan to kind of discreetly verify her identity, even though she was covered maybe with a veil or whatever it might be, or it was nighttime. But at the last moment, Rachel, in her compassion for her sister Leah, we didn't want her to be a spinster and never marry, or maybe worse yet, to end up in the clutches of Esav, the rapacious older brother of Yaakov. She agreed to surreptitiously give to Leah those signs so that Yaakov married Leah fully believing she was Rachel because she even knew the signs, whatever they were. And therefore, he ended up with Leah and he married Rachel a week later as well. But you see the love, you see the devotion, you see the lack of rivalry and jealousy. So therefore, says Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, that's why Yaakov is able to marry the two sisters, because according to the Rambam, that the reason for the prohibition is because of jealousy. And these two women, these girls are so close to one another, they're not jealous of one another. So therefore, he was allowed to marry them. And that is why Rachel said, Im ein mesa anochi. It's not that without children, it's as if I'm dead. That's not the point. It's because of my jealousy. Says Rachel, if I am jealous of my sister now, then we are in a situation in which we're not allowed to marry you. You're not allowed to be married to the two of us. So this is why Rachel says, V'im ein mesa anochi, then I've got to die, because you can't be married to two sisters. So that's why I'm jealous, and this is why I was thinking of calling our shir tonight "Jealous Unto Death," because it's not the childlessness per se, but it's the jealousy of her sister. And I would just like to end, therefore, with the observation that I think the Torah here is suggesting according to this interpretation, an interesting perspective, and that is that you see that jealousy is more bitter than death. You see the pain of jealousy. Jealousy consumes the one who is jealous, and I'm sure it does no benefit for the one who evokes the jealousy either. Jealousy and resentment and pain or grief or anger or a feeling of purposelessness because of another person's success. And this is human nature. I'm not disputing it, but how corrosive is it? How damaging is it? Rachel said, I'd rather die. My jealousy is consuming me to the point that I would rather die. And we have this also in the case of Haman. Haman was at the top of the world. He was the viceroy, and the king was so devoted to him and elevated him. And he says, you know what? Kol ze einenu shaveli, because Mordechai doesn't bow to me, so it's all worth nothing for me. This is the consequence. This is the price of jealousy. So although that's not the main point of this, but I think it follows from this as well. So just, I don't think we need to summarize, but I'll just sort of recap the last point that we've made. It's a new insight, I think a novel insight into Vim Ayin Meis Anochin, if not, I will die, because her jealousy, she realizes that it's only the absence of jealousy which enabled her to marry the two of them to be married to Yaakov. Obviously, the Rambam himself does not mean to say that two sisters were not jealous of one another. They're allowed to marry one bloke. He doesn't mean that. But before the giving of the Torah, at that level, Yaakov was able to make that judgment. So thank you for listening. Again, I'm sorry we've gone a little bit over, but I hope you'll agree it's some fascinating and always creative material from Rabbi Yonatan Eibeschutz, and wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos. And